Okay, without further ado, we're going to jump into some of these questions, and I'm excited to be on this panel with you all. So the first opener question is, since we're thinking about, right, equity in the front line and where the movement goes from here, as we think about this idea of a just culture, what does that feel like to you, and what do you imagine it to be? And I'm going to ask you to hold off on your discussion of the equity mindset, except for the intersections a little bit, but a little bit about what a just culture feels like, what it looks like, and what you imagine it to be. No. We're trying that. We're good. We're conversation.
Hi everyone. That's I'm like so beautiful today. And my mom made me wear this dress, but the Chanel wearing pants. I too echo thank you, Rose. Thank you to the McSilver team. Thank you to I see Ross here. I see Dr. Tony here, who are also people that contributed to this book. So thank you so much. I love this question as to like what a just culture feels like, because I like to think with my senses. So it feels like I just came back from Austria not too long ago. The higher we went hiking, the air got crisper, right? So when I think of a just culture, I think of like clean air. I think of a just culture, I think about waking up and not feeling well and being able to go back to bed. When I think of a just culture, I feel like literally it taking 3 seconds for me to go home and go back home. So I think just culture for me is really about how the improvements that we're all fighting for are just things you don't have to fight for anymore. They're just living. So that's what a just culture feels like.
Thank you. Do you want to? Yes, I'm happy to. Again, thank you all for leading me in this conversation, and I really do love this question. And it needs a little, I'll look at it a little differently from the perspective of the work that I do as a civil rights lawyer. And to me, a just culture, at least justice, is fighting for communities where everyone has access to the tools of a choice-filled life, where everyone can make choices about what they do, who they are, and those choices are ones that come with the tools in order to make them meaningful. I think we have communities where we hoard resources in some communities, and then other communities are starved of resource, of opportunity, of network, of connection, of choices. And I want to make sure that every community, every individual in our communities have access to everything that they need in their.
And I'll just finish by saying, I underscore what both of you said, and I sort of operate with the principles of Juan Grenier, right? Full citizenship, which is still access to everything in society that allows one to actually fully occupy one's life, occupy one's health, occupy one's education, and occupy one's community and family. So my second question really is, as we think about this work and emphasize the importance of equity, and there are definitions, I even know the definitions of illustrations. I'm sure we've seen fencers and all kinds of things. Okay, the fence, okay? To do this work, you see a lot of colors, a lot of images. In the book, you specifically define equity, though. So can you talk to us about this concept of equity and your specific definition? And in particular, why equity as a concept is so relevant to really unpacking and thinking about this contemporary and future workplaces and what's happening in these workplaces.
Yeah, so let me start a little bit with that last part around why the workplace, because I don't think equity or the equity mindset is one that's limited to the workplace. But I do think that there's a very interesting, historically, there's a very interesting relationship between labor and especially the bodies that most of us in this room encompass. So there's this conversation around what does it mean for somebody like me with my intersections to actually experience equity that may look a little bit different than my supervisors or my bosses, right? So there is this, in a lot of the spaces that I support, there is this failure to look at equity as one that addresses filling the gaps that human beings actually have to experience in the spaces that they're in. In fact, it's such a failure that in many ways, and we will use a lot of terms. Some of them will be, DEIB or JEID or whatever it is. But whatever those tools are in the workspace, the original origin of them were an extension of affirmative action cases, mostly thought by Black people and Black organizations, civil rights organizations, but in some ways have been watered a little bit, diluted a lot bit. That I found it very interesting that D&I, when it was first created, was intentionally D&I. E was something that many folks fought for as being the umbrella by which D&I should be under, so that's number one. But that also means that definitionally, we do not have a shared definition of what equity is. And so for me, I look at equity as both a process, which is about action, and then an outcome. And oftentimes when people are talking about equity, they are focused on the outcome. So for example, if you're in health equity, you are looking at the ways that things are remedied on that health spectrum. More broadly, I feel that equity needs to, yes, include fairness, and yes, include justice. And sure, it should include that we all started differently. But it also needs to include that we don't just start differently, but that we actually live differently. That just because I am in the same law firm as you, that does not mean that my process towards becoming a lawyer is all of a sudden eradicated just because I'm in that space. It actually means that the things that I have to go through are going to be more of a challenge, more of a hurdle, and that those things actually do matter when we're talking about experientially, what does that then mean for this end result of a just culture? So I do think that the process of equity has to be inclusive of the ways people live through inequity, not just the way people start with inequity. And then of course the outcome of equity should also be a driving force, because again, you can do D&I efforts and not necessarily do equity. You could have a project that focuses on representation and focuses on belonging, but you may not reduce anything. So I do think that whatever the definition is, we have to get a little bit more firm about the problems that exist, because we only are talking about equity because there are inequities. We would not talk about equity if inequity didn't exist, right? So there has to be a little bit of a mathematical approach. Yes, data matters, but data is also inclusive of narratives and stories and realities, and these are often the things that people do not want to talk about. When they hear our experiences, they would rather focus on what their metrics and what their bottom line is, but they do not want to focus on the experiences that are the stories behind the bottom line. So that is half my
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about equity in the law?
Sure, so I'm not trying to compete with the two of you. I'm not. This is, bring to the, I don't have the DEIB knowledge. It's, it's a very a specific frame, and you will bring expertise to that work that I don't have. But we do think about equity in the context of social justice and racial justice. Advocacy is something that you wrote in the book I think was really helpful in talking about the limits of our current standpoint on equity. You said that there are limits of focusing on fair and impartial as a way of getting at inequity. And I think that resonated with me because the fair and impartial piece speaks to equality. And we're often in the law, this framework is equality. And equality is about everyone being treated the same. Exactly the same, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of where they came and how they show up. We want to treat everyone the same. The civil rights movement, I think, and Brown versus Board of Education are kind of quintessential examples of equality, where you had a system where Black people were not allowed to attend schools with white people, and there was value, real value, in saying that we're going to enforce equality and that everybody will be able to attend schools regardless of their race. Everyone will be able to access this income, and everyone will be able to ride the bus. No whites only war feminists. And so it was really important for us to do that. And so equality has a place, but we also know the limits of equality, because we're in a system now where our schools are more segregated than they were during the times of Brown versus Board of Education. So we know that there are limits to this equality focus, and we need to shift to thinking about equity. And equity, and I agree totally with your definition, equity recognizes that each person comes with different circumstances and different history, different challenges, different hurdles. And then what we need to give them is what they need to overcome the challenges, circumstances, and hurdles. What they need is what they need to navigate the space, depending on where they come to this situation. They have to have opportunities and resources allocated based on their needs. And an example of how this plays out in racial justice is in New York City and our the education system. New York City has these specialized high schools. There's 8 of them. I don't speak it's required, right? So there's 8 of them. And the way you get into specialized high schools is through this single test, the SAT. And in theory, there's a quality there because every student can take the SAT. There's no hurdle to actually taking the test. But the result of that is a system in which about, I think it's 7% of the seats in our specialized high schools go to Black and Latinx students in a school system that is about 70% Black and Latinx. And so there's really nothing equitable about that system. Either you believe in the worst stereotypes about Black and brown people, or you believe that there's something wrong with our system. And the problem is that there's not equity because our students don't start in the same place. Our students may have technical access to this test, but they don't have meaningful access to the test. They don't have access to the test prep that's going to make them be able to do well. They don't have access to the curriculum. Some schools, students don't even know about the test at all, much less sign up to take it. So we have a system where there is equality, but it results in inequity because we are not addressing the needs of each individual and each community and giving them what they need to be successful in this system. And it's becoming, as we heard Rose talk about, more difficult to address because we have this pushback, this resistance to equity. We have this insistence on fair and impartial, and that means you don't get anything that I don't get, although we need different things. It's getting, as we said, more difficult. We know that this work is cyclical, that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that advances are always met with retrenchment. And if 2020 was a time of a racial reckoning, a very brief racial reckoning where we saw some advance, then 2021, 2022, and 2023 have all been times of retrenchment and pushback. And so we've had these powerful conversations about race and equity and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the pushback is a clamping down on the ability to have those conversations, the ability to do that work. We had communities come out and protest in record numbers. And the reaction to that, the clamp down on the ability to engage in First Amendment protected activities, and the protest to have your voices be heard. Black people came out and voted in record numbers, and the pushback has been that we got them down on the right to vote, on the access to the ballot. And I think the energy and viciousness of that retrenchment shows the power of the message that we're telling, the power of that story, of the facts that the data that we were coming with. And it's important because it has implications for the policies that you pursue, whether or not they're going to fight for equity. If you believe that Black people have access to less wealth and income because they're lazy, because they don't want to work hard, because they don't care about education, then that allows a set of policies to proceed for you to feel good about where we are. But if you learn that Black people have less wealth because we had policies and laws that limited their ability to purchase homes, did not give them access to resources that white communities had to buy homes because of deep racial segregation, that our children don't have access to educational resources the same way that other people do, then a different set of policies are allowed to flourish. If you believe that grades are important and that SATs are a measure of merit and ability, then you're upset when we use race conscious admissions programs. But if you learn about the way that those things create inequities for our children, for people and their ability to access higher education, then you feel differently about race conscious initiative programs.
And thank you both for that, because I think for me, equity is about that historical, right? Also that historical accountability, which is about those exclusions that are systemic, part of the process, that impact the process of that, right? Creating those inequities, about creating processes of equity. And so my next question for you all is really, and if in your book, and I think this is really great, particularly as we think about all the work that's going on around innovation and design thinking and all of that. And so you differentiate, particularly around this concepts of design and growth mindset and self-help, where self-help can be used a lot, So could you talk to us a little bit about your definition of an equity mindset and link that back to this idea of process that you were talking about? And you have the 4 components: centering, clarity, connection, and community. So talk to us about why this is so important in this equation part of us.
Yeah, so, as Dylan was speaking, I was reminded, and maybe this is why I'm also sitting in the middle between Lisa and Milra, because in no way, shape, or form did I ever think I was going to land in any type of D&I world. That's not my ministry. It's still already in my ministry. I mean, a lot of D&I people mad. It's okay. But I say that because as Deborah was speaking, there was this point, and I'm sure many of you all were in spaces where 2020 was very poignant as a collective conversation around what is happening and why is all of this happening, at the same time. What is it that kind of it's almost like when mushrooms, I'm infatuated with how fungus speak to each other and how trees speak to each other. So there was something that actually, for anybody that watches The Last of Us, right? Like this concept of something got awakened at the same time, that for many of us that have been doing this work, it literally is almost like the point of why we're doing this work is when is everyone at the same time going to wake up so that we don't have to keep explaining that this is a problem. But the concept of an equity mindset, which is why I think the book is difficult to, in some ways, defend, and in a lot of ways I don't defend it, is that I think many folks in this room have always had an equity mindset, which is to say they've always moved in a world where they have either loved to be a problem solver or been forced to be a problem solver. So an equity mindset is really about how we are seeing not just ourselves in the environment, which in many ways other types of mindsets see you as being the problem that needs to be fixed. But an equity mindset is about how do you understand and see a problem, and then what is your lane and your assignment to that problem, right? And also recognizing that because equity evolves, that an equity mindset is forward-moving, but also has this, Ghanaian principle of Sankofa, it needs to go back to the Jufa about history. It actually needs to go back to move forward. So there is this resistance to actually going back into things that make people feel comfortable. There is this resistance to going back to see what are the things that worked for communities in the past as blueprints. And a lot of the things that have worked in our communities are the things that will never ever be seen as masterful, right? The way that no matter if there wasn't any money, there was always going to be a dinner every Sunday. The way that, the young child that everyone labeled as having ADHD somehow can sit at the hair salon for 8 hours straight, cause no problem near their hair breaking. We should think about, what is it about that environment that actually then transformed a problem into a homeostasis of normalcy or safety or what have you. So, the first chapter kind of goes into the characteristics of an equity mindset because it's more of a way of being. But I do think that one of the things you do have to push back from, and this is not only in workspaces, but legal spaces, medical spaces, we all have been handed a set of rules that most of us have not had the power to actually push back against. So an equity mindset is also about how you are actively, not necessarily improving yourself to become a greater version of achievement and success, but you are improving your way of being, recognizing that if you take on equity, and I also like to say equity is a choice, if you take on the equity work, then there is there is a different relationship that you have with success and failure. There's a different relationship you have with innovation and experimentation. There's a joy you have when you are able to kind of achieve the thing, but as I like to say, the reward for equity is more equity, right? In a world that likes to state their flag and say, this is my state, or this is my, achievement, or I won this, or I won that, which is the white dominant culture that we have adhered to, and in many places and spaces, winning is really about net gain, like what were you able to gain, whether money or population, et cetera. Doing equity work is really humbling, and I think that's why it's hard for people to sustain, because it's not necessarily about winning in the traditional way of winning. It actually is about a lot of bravery and trying things and then trying new things, even if you achieve the thing. So yeah, I think that I will also say that while I did focus on growth and fixed as examples, I also struggle with, and I was gonna kind of build into it, that like, I don't know how many people grew up hearing something called like the poverty mindset, but I also think that the equity mindset is one that is not presented to a particular, maybe the audience that people thought it would be presented to. I think when you see my name, shout out to my parents that gave me a name with 13 letters, and they're probably told not a white person. And I think a lot of times when people that look like us are in the spaces to talk about equity, there is this subconscious assumption that the audience is white people. And I think one of the things that has been like one of the biggest compliments is that people read and they're like, oh shoot, like I went through that too, or oh wow, that like I feel like I have a space or a role in this. I do think that for equity to actually thrive, it does also recenter who's the expert. And I think we have even been too afraid to say that like we actually know how to problem solve not just our communities, but many communities, because we are forced to be problem solvers on a daily basis. When the laws fall short, when policies fall short, our communities are making it to the polls, not because of these laws, but in spite of. Our communities have taught our kids, not because of, a school system that is behind those young people, but because there are great teachers that are in those spaces doing double the work. And it's really important for us to identify what then is the DNA and the blueprint of people that are already doing the mindset, and to make sure that they are at the forefront of leading the work, not necessarily either diminished, minimized, or brought in to be silenced. Which is my final point, is that the equity mindset is not connected to a title. It's not a position. It's not, there's not a formal way of training and being. When Deborah was speaking, and I'm just reminded of like the times like coming back from Ferguson or whatever spaces and talking to people like Dr. Tony, because I needed my own healing work. There was this phrase, I can't even take credit for it, but I use it a lot of times, that says that when we get killed, they read books. And it was this concept of, all of a sudden, the industry of thought pieces, people thought that think pieces was the way we were going to get free, right? Like that we needed another article to showcase like what the problem was, and yet we are seeing people still scared to do the do. So the book in many ways is really about how do you activate, or how do you believe and use, how do you believe that you actually have enough to do enough right now? And that part of the work is also learning how to do more and do better, yes, but also like we have enough, like we actually have enough. And that should make us more serious that we are sitting, if you will, on what I think could be the most radical form of transformation and disruption. And yes, it is scary, because that does mean that there are things about your life that you would have to decide it's worth like fighting for. But I do think that it also doesn't necessarily mean that we're marching every day. There are things you can do in your cubicle that operate the equity mindset, that ensures that somebody who is struggling a little bit more to live in that space has a more equitable experience. And so it is a macro, there's a macro vision if we all were to activate it, but I do think that there are more tangible micro steps that we can take in the spaces that we're in.
Okay, thank you so much. And so, yes, I think you really outlined a great deal there in terms of thinking about how do we center, right? What does that reimagination look like? I'm going to switch it up a little bit and ask my next question, which is really about this idea of struggle, right, and pushback, because both of you have talked now about that, and so I'm going to for you to solve the questions in advance. Okay, so the work culture, and we know this about organizational cultures, and so in fact Robert Livingston is a professor at Harvard, and I've given these lectures, and so we've talked about organizations as animals, right? Different kinds of animals. So I say in the last 20 years, I've worked for a giraffe, a bear, and a panther. Well, if you know where I work, you can guess which one. But they're all animals, but very different animals, right? And so how they work, how they operate, right? And so if we think about dominant culture, organizational cultures, we know that those cultures often, and you write this in the book, you actually, in your second chapter, work culture and how it erases us all. And then later, actually at the end of your book, you talk about this idea of struggle, and you actually quote Frederick Douglass. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read them one, okay? Here's a quote from Frederick Douglass. Quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want, and you can add it, men who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its mighty waters," end quote. So talk to us about this idea of struggle, pushback, how cultures push back, what that looks like, and what we need to be doing and thinking about in today's state. That's an easy question, but it's real simple.
My mic works anyway. So this is why I wanted to wear pants. And for people that know me personally, this is where the introverted church girl then becomes really, really pissed off. A lot of what we saw was the best of the movement and the most frustrating parts of the movement over the last decade. And I say that because in a lot of workspaces, we are now seeing a lot of people who had just received certain roles and positions getting fired, ousted, super minimized. They may still remain, but their entire teams and divisions are being cut out. And I'm sure there are people behind closed doors that are creating a business reason as to why they're doing what they're doing, right? But what is really, the reason why I think that's focused on Frederick Douglass's quote is because we often use the shortened version of that quote, which is like, there's no progress without struggle. But what he's actually speaking to is that we also do justice and service if we say we want justice, but we don't want to do the justice work, which also means we don't want to support the justice workers. I still think there is a debt to be paid for every mostly poor individual who marched in the streets, who organized, disruptions, who were there whether the cameras weren't there or not. And I'm talking about way before, George Floyd. I'm talking about Sean Bell. I'm talking about Amadou Diallo. Like we have the frustrating thing about being in a white dominant culture is it treats each of these incidences as if they're new, as opposed to, and I forget which one had said that they're cyclical. Like we actually know that unfortunately we're probably leading up on another major case where one of our family members is going to be harmed and we're all going to come out into the streets and we're all going to march. That part I don't have a problem with. I always tell people, like, I'm one of those people that I believe in the both and I'm going to be out there as well. But that is not the only part of the struggle. right? And in some ways, there's also safety in numbers. There's something to be said about struggle, just like conflict, is in many ways when the safety is gone. So how are you actually pushing against the needle when people start to get comfortable? And even though you've hired a lot of people within the last 3 to 4 years, you're also seeing that a lot of those people have either not been promoted, many of them have left, many of them have been fired, right? And now it's just you, right? And that's a whole separate conversation about when you're just the only ... Some people like that. Some people really enjoy it. I do not enjoy it, but I do think that that is a separate conversation. But there's also a design that is the status quo of a lot of organizations. They have never had this many of us in these spaces, right? So we have people that come into spaces, but the equity mindset on an organizational level is, how does the organization not look at representation as the thing? How do they look at it as a shift in the actual culture and the dynamic as the thing, and one that we are all struggling together with? That's usually where a lot of people that look like us struggle internally, because we're actually moving, like we're waking up, we're kissing our family, we're going to work. We know that it's going to be, there's going to be some type of conundrum, usually along some type of cultural issue, but we are prepared for it. Why? Because struggle sometimes is a sign of progress. But if you have never struggled, then you're going to think something is failing. And then you're going to try to get rid of the thing that is actually helping to move your organization to transform, because that thing is causing a friction that you think is taken away from the bottom line, right? So to me, I think that we have to help define for organizations like that struggle, that you can't just bring my body into the space, you actually have to bring the struggle. And that doesn't mean that you have to bring all of my personal struggle, but you do have to struggle to reimagine this space with new people and new energy that are in this space. And I do think that what movement helped us to do is it helped us to reimagine a world where people refuse to stay still when these things are happening. Very quickly, I struggle with, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, and there's a lot about things like gifted and talented and special ed and alternative school. All those things really trouble me as a young person. I know that depending on the type of teacher that I had, I could have been in any of those spaces. And I happened to be gifted and talented, but I was a disruptive mother trucker before I got into gifted and talented. You got into that chapter around equity journeys. I do that as a way to let people know that it is so fickle that somebody can make a choice as to my entire destiny based off of one argument or disagreement. Thankfully, it was looked upon as this is a hyper kid, she needs to be in a different type of space, but it could have gone a completely different way. But I say all that to say that the kids that were really my ace boom boom were the trouble kids. That's what implies kids. You just label them as the way teachers label them, the trouble kids, the kids in ISS and OSS. Right, always in school, but they're always in the room where they're facing the wall because they were bad the day before. And I sit now and think about, what if it's the young people that were considered delinquents, or the young kids that were disruptive that actually were the smart ones? What if it was in their DNA that this shit doesn't work for regular people, and I refuse to make this the norm? I'm actually rebelling against this conformity, because this conformity is teaching me and grooming me to be something that I don't agree with. What if they were right? Right? And I think that has us look at our criminal justice system differently. It has us look at this affirmative action case is not one that is about just higher education, but about how we want to keep pipelines that are designed to keep normalcy. But that also means that there's a consequence for individuals that in many ways struggle, and they get beat for struggling, and they get put in spaces for struggle. So I also want to acknowledge that many people don't struggle because they understand that you get punished when you try to lead with struggling, right? So we have a choice. So when I say equity is a choice, I'm really saying that some people probably shouldn't jump rope with me, right? We probably shouldn't do this thing. Because to do it is to understand that you can't shortchange progress by just saying you want progress, but you don't want the work for progress, right? And that there are going to be some differences. It's bad. I'm speaking really for those that have a little bit more privilege than some of us in this room. The privilege that you have is not necessarily to make me feel better and to make me feel included, although I think that's great. That's, I'll be there at Taco Tuesday if it's on. But the privilege, I would rather your privilege be about how then do you kind of slip the paragon that you wear the backpack of struggle, that you are actually the one that's jeopardizing your job on a daily basis. Because many of us come in and we get fought if we disrupt, but we also get fought if we do our job well, which is a whole separate conversation. Black women, holla, it means that do your job well, and that just makes you then the target in the workplace, right? So struggle is a complex term, but I do think that for those that have your privilege, I do think Frederick Douglass is saying, because he's speaking to mostly white audiences in his writings, that you can't say you want freedom for me and then you don't want to do liberation work. It just doesn't, it doesn't work.
Thank you very much. Sorry to know that.
I think we just kind of walk ready plans and join just so can you talk to us and because as we think about struggle, and a lot has been struggle with the law and through the laws, and most recently obviously we have this decision around affirmative action and admission. So talk to us a little bit about initial struggle, as we might say.
Okay. So but there's a couple things in my head I just wanted to echo what you said. I go back to that President Douglas quote quite a bit as well. And to me, it speaks to people not wanting the fight for justice to be disruptive. They want to be able to go about their everyday life and there be no interruptions, no inconvenience. They don't want to, don't mess with my subway, don't make my commute more difficult. And that's not possible because the struggle for justice today requires the oceans for us, and it requires thunder and lightning. And it's got to be disruption. People are going to have to be uncomfortable. And you cannot say you want justice if you want to live in your comfort and your privilege. And you also talked about this not being new, right? The struggles are not new. Well, they are not new. You said that equity evolves, but inequity also evolves. Something about racism and oppression and the way that it persists in its power is because it evolves. Racism adapts. Racism is malleable. Racism is creative. And so we have a situation where Black people are not about to vote, and you adopt the 15th Amendment that says Black men, whether the court for it stated, are allowed to vote. But then America responds with poll taxes and grandfather clauses and voter ID laws and redistricting and voter purges. And then America says that segregation is illegal. But then America responds with redlining and denying mortgages and living while Black and crime-free housing ordinances. And America says slavery is illegal. And then America responds with mass incarceration and police brutality. And so we have to continue to work and evolve in our tactics and how we challenge inequality, because inequality does not go away. As Derek Phillips talks about, it's a permanent fixture of who we are as a society, but how it presents itself evolves. So our strategies, when we come at this work, it has to evolve. And so talking about the affirmative action cases, which are painful, I think, to talk about. So I think Rose mentioned earlier that this affirmative action case, students for fair admission versus Harvard, and then students for fair admission versus UNC, really upended decades. It was 50 years of precedent where we recognize the importance of diversity in higher education. We recognize the importance of having race-conscious admissions programs. And there was a formula that we had to follow. And that colleges and universities were doing exactly that. They were following it step by step by step. But then we have this Supreme Court decision this summer that really upended that. The court said that they questioned the educational benefits of diversity. They questioned whether race-conscious admissions could actually even achieve kind of the benefits of diversity. They said that affirmative action hurt Asian students. They said it requires us to use stereotypes of students of color and assume people think alike. And they said that it was discrimination. Robert said we have to end all discrimination. But what they didn't recognize, or what they didn't acknowledge, I think they recognized quite clearly, was that affirmative action was doing the work to try to correct from our inequitable systems. That we have this backlog of K through 12, where we have racially identifiable schools and children of color have less access to resources, to opportunities that would make them competitive in a lot of these institutions of higher education. That we had a system that then uses admissions criteria that magnify that inequality and make it less likely that they can access opportunity. And the Supreme Court struck down all this precedent in the name of the STEM colorblind ideal, forcing us into this colorblind world. And the court saying that we cannot consider race, use race. It's going to do real damage in a world that is shaped by racial inequality. And you don't make racism go away by ignoring race. So we're going to have just see a really deepening of inequality and access to some institutions of higher education. And it's going to be, Justice Ginsburg wrote in the context of the voting rights case that you don't throw away your umbrella while it's raining because you're not getting wet. And what we saw after we threw away that umbrella, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, was this flood of litigation and this flood of statutes that made it harder and harder for Black people to access the ballot and other people of color. So we're going to see this same kind of flood of policies and practices that make it harder for Black people and other people of color to access higher education. Where I think the response is often to try to fix children, to say we're going to give you access to test prep. We're going to make sure that you have access to after-school activities. And it kind of assumes that our children are broken. Our children are not broken. The system is broken. So what we need to do is fix this system about how we access higher education. We're going to see a lot of litigation to try to even narrow that even further. The court said it's okay if you talk about your race in your essay if that helps shape who you are. And it's important for students of color to be able to talk about their race because it does shape who we are in a society that is shaped by race and racism. Who you are and how you identify racially shapes so much about who we are. And only students of color would be limited in talking about who they are, obstacles they overcame. They may not be able to talk about their leadership because they can't mention that they're Black. But so Justice Roberts says you can do that. But there will be lots of litigation to constrain that even further. We're already seeing challenges that are trying to extend this precedent that only applies in the context of higher education. So for every corporation that says, now I can't do my DE&I work, you are full of it. This has nothing to do with you. It only applies to higher education. So we are seeing this wave of litigation challenging diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts, challenging scholarships for kids who are from a particular race. What we cannot do is do their work for them. If they want to file litigation to get the Supreme Court to extend that precedent to them, then let them do that. Let them spend their money, but don't help them. Don't volunteer to do that work for them. And then we're also going to see a hope attempts to work around that decision. Again, we'll see some efforts to fix our children. I don't think we should shy away from that. More access to opportunity is great, or access to after-school activities is great. If they want to protest prep at our students, great. But a better solution would be to get rid of all those criteria that are hurdles to children of color. To develop a system where it's not reliable, not relying on SATs that serves as a gatekeeper, where it doesn't measure your access to opportunity and your access to wealth in order to get access to higher education. To really find ways to engage other criteria, socioeconomic status, the nature of your community. None of those things are going to replace race, but we've got to do the best that we can with the tools that we have. But that was just a lot about that.
Can I just add something that absolutely to add more about prevention? So for folks that follow me on IG, which I actually don't recommend that you do. I'm just saying if you did. I would put part of the dissent from Ketanji, Honorable Ketanji Monica Brown Jackson, on purpose, because when I was in law school, I used to be infatuated with sort of the Marshall's dissents. I really think his dissents in many ways have translated into laws and policies that we now adhere to now. But the concept of the dissent is that you're the loser. right? Like you're not winning, but you are documenting some thoughts. But what I love about the very few 2 out of 3 Black justices on the court is that she used her dissent to highlight, again, the evolution of the original sentiments of the original thievery of this land, right? Of those that were considered the framers. And so she highlights specifically after the Civil War, the debate that was happening between the framers. And she said, quote, this was from Senator John Sherman, who after the war was in favor of the 14th Amendment and thus in favor of Black people being free. He said, we are bound by every obligation by the service of Black Americans on the battlefield, by their heroes who are buried in our cause, by their patriotism in the hours that tried our country. We are bound to protect them and all their natural rights. And then later on, the Reconstruction Congress passed a bill to secure that all citizens had the same civil rights enjoyed by white citizens. President Andrew Johnson vetoed it. He vetoed it because it, quote, discriminated in favor of the Negro. What I think is really missing, first of all, in this equity conversation is that white people don't know their own history. That white people actually have a history that is about debate and struggle. It is about recognizing that there have been sacrifices. This conversation about affirmative action, I'm gonna be very honest with you, affirmative action wasn't perfect anyway. And it doesn't mean we didn't need it. It was that, like you said, this imperfect tool that now is gone creates an even larger hole as to how we actually remedy. But what it also does, it forces us to almost lose track of that history that Deborah was talking about, this cyclical nature. And what I love about what Ketanji has done is she didn't make this up. She pulled out history so you can reference for yourself that there has always been this falseness around merit as it relates to Black people. That it's not enough to die as a slave for a country that you don't even know if on the other side you're gonna be free. That's not enough, right? Because Andrew Jackson was like, I can't actually change that because that would actually make the Black person equal. And so I just want us to recognize that as we are talking about affirmative action and as we're talking about in my opinion, also the unfortunate pitting of marginalized communities against each other, which is also by design, right? Because one of the things that many people don't know is that here in New York City, from ages 0 to 4, Asian American young people are actually the poorest and the most malnourished in this city. And there's also a lot of cultural reasons why that is the case. And unfortunately, some of that is the fact that there is this pride, and not pride as in I'm too proud, but there is this sentiment within a lot of cultures that we don't necessarily want to be seen as in need of support and help. And having been on the other side working in the mayor's office, focused just on the young people of color, what that meant is that there were a lot of hungry children that were in the city that we don't even talk about. And that's not for shaming purposes, that's to say that we actually are all in many ways marginalized similarly, but we don't like to talk about it. So I do think that affirmative action, now that it's gone, presents a reintroducing of history as to the original sentiment that we were never intended to, I hate to say it, but we were never intended to be equal, regardless of how much effort we put out.
Affirmative action is not gone, though. It's not. Race not just for Black people are, but the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action have always been white women, and they will continue to be. And this is where, so I think, right, speaking of that, it's important for us to know that. And I love that you spoke on Ketanji Jackson's dissent, because it speaks to the importance of her being on the court. Everyone said when she was being confirmed, well, her vote's not going to matter because she's still going to be outvoted. Her presence mattered, right? His representation matters, but her dissents matter in the way that Justice Sotomayor's dissents mattered, even when she didn't have votes, that Justice Thurgood Marshall's mattered. It shows to the world that there was a different story. It was a different outcome. Like, people tend to believe that the facts lean to the, you apply it to the law, there's a set outcome. The justices are just speaking the truth, the inevitable truth when you mix the facts with the law. And their dissent showed that something else was possible, that those were choices that just aren't so really innovate different choices.
And to this point of history, and I'm glad you said it's because affirmative action isn't dead, but the way that it's getting a narrative on us and the story, and we know that the stories are actually what we re-narrativize history through these stories that we tell. And I just wanted to feedback. I actually taught a class for a number of years called The Constructions of a Nation, which my students renamed The Constructions of Whiteness. It was 1790 to 1924. It was you on the 1890s and like this conflated into sinister theory. And then in 1924, the reaffirmation of that from the 1892 census. And so I think that you're very right about how that whiteness is made, constructed, etc. But then the after, right, to today, in terms of thinking about affirmative action, the beneficiaries, and that historicism to really see books being banned, the pushback against affirmative action, all of these things that are helping teach you in the school, push back against DEI, etc. All right, so thank you. I'm going to switch it up just a little bit, but this is because one of the things that you all have been talking about a lot are the inequities, right? The inequities, and then, of course, this conversation about equity. But these inequities have real effects, real impact, real deleterious, right, effects. And so what I've noticed, and so I want to turn this to talk about a little bit about health and well-being. And so as we see recently in the news, because I'm in higher education, seeing two presidents die in office, one while on stage giving a talk at Temple University. We know that the wealth gap between, if we think about women and pressures, and she talked about the intersectional uses for the Insight report, the wealth gap between white and black and all women of color is actually $42,000 to $5 in terms of wealth. We know that mental health issues, particularly when people of color are show mental health, they're much more likely to be institutionalized or incarcerated, as you've talked about, and not helped in certain kinds of ways. So can we talk a little bit about, because one of the things that you turn toward in the text is this idea of organizational, not just individual care, or that's that move away from self-help, but to think about organizational and structural care, and so that we move into the space of equity. So could you talk to us a little bit about what that might look like, and see how as you think about some of these inequities that have these really deleterious effects?
Yeah, I mean, there are people that are probably even way more deeper in practitioner work. I call out Dr. Tony Lewis because not only for leadership at the labor space at SEIU, but also the fact that the concept of care, let me just bring it down to COVID. We are still struggling with how care is kind of like a birthright for everyone, number one, but also the people who are the caregivers are not respected enough, right? Care as a concept is a genderized term, and that matters, right? Because number one, all women, all femme folk are expected to, in many ways, care, but also care for free, right? And the flip side is there really is no standard for men or masculine, those who are more masculine to present themselves as experts of care. And therefore, as non-participants, because we are in a society where there is no expectation of everyone participating in care, then the design of care in spaces where we are underrepresented, we, not just from a race dynamic, but race, gender, and to an extent, economic privilege. There's this one contributor who is the executive director of BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration. She said, yeah, everybody's talking about care, everybody wants care in their organization, but who is going to actually build the care within the organization? Do we look at the people that actually have to build the care in the organization? And she is highlighting that in itself is also genderized within institutions, that it disproportionately still falls on women and often women of color to design the care that everyone else is going to benefit from, that system may actually not even benefit from because she's too tired from actually making sure that God can take care of, right? And so I do think that the concept of care and even the definition of equity must include some type of commitment to safety. And I do think that safety has a little bit more maybe of a muscle or something that care maybe doesn't translate to. Because some of this is like, I don't have enough time to change people's definition of things. Care kind of lands in a certain way for most people. But safety is something that I think all of us can agree that we deserve to have. So what does that mean? That means that we're going to have to do better assessments within our organizations as to what safety looks like in the organization. And that then includes how well is it or easy is it for people to report that something is unsafe? Are those spaces anonymous? And while I do think that HR professionals are professionals, I also think that there hasn't been enough resourcing in those spaces for them to be trained as individuals to support safety as a requirement. I also think that there have been, if I can be very honest, in spaces where a lot of HR offices are problematic and are the ones that actually perpetuate some of the unsafe conditions within spaces. And not because they want to. Some spaces it's because they are outnumbered. It's literally 2 or 3 individuals. They're the ones kind of shuttling the problem back to the person that they feel like is the cause of the problem. But there actually isn't a commitment to a process that helps us really imagine how do we get through this conflict and coexist with each other on the other side. So I think that there needs to be a little bit more, again, the blueprints of people and spaces like the Kahami River Collective and the Black Panthers Party and the Young Lords. There is something around transformational justice, not restorative justice. Restorative justice tried, but transformational justice really then envisions that everyone actually is going to be, but let's just imagine everybody in this room, we all have to build Mars together forever. So people, for the most part, are going to have to stay. At some point in time, almost everyone in this room is going to be not only a recipient of harm, but a harm doer. So when that happens, do we have the tools here to ensure that we can go through some type of a process that ultimately has us coexist in the same space? Well, to do that, you're going to actually have to look at conflict very differently, management of conflict differently, and invest in safety as that of a safety precaution. And so I'll just wrap up by saying that a lot of the organizations, even what we're seeing with the ousting and the departure of a lot of individuals that are tasked with doing this work, is that they are tasked as doing this work as an individual. The organization has not taken on the commitment of doing that work. They want somebody to come in and bring in an eraser and erase all the things and then design all the things, when it actually has to be a communal obligation. But communal is something that feels very, very natural for me as an intersectional being, that I have to recognize that a lot of people in power, they know of a dominant culture, but they don't know about community. So if community is not part of your DNA, designing community to be safe is also not going to be in your DNA.
And so we're coming to our last question. Our last question. So in the text, let me just say, get the book, read the book. There's lots of information in this text. So then you can say that. We're at cover phone calls, query, develop warrants. I mean, there's a lot. There's conversations, there are culture chats. There's a lot in the text. So please go out and purchase the text and keep it, as Rose said, and the Amazon #1 list out. So one of the points, though, and this links to this last point, which is about care, and one of the points is that you set on joy. You even alluded to it earlier, and this idea of why joy is important. So how do you uplift this concept? What does it mean to you? How do you think about it? Talk to us a little bit, those that have no book. And
Yes, it's about you. In the book, yes. Well, I'm listening to you. Go ahead.
No, I think we all imagine joy, and I forgot to also highlight Lenara, who I speak to every day, is also in this book, and that's important. She would be your idea in this book. I also want to say that, like, joy for Lenara and they look very different. Joy is probably getting like Chinese food on time for her children, so she could be in this space. And the joy for me could look very different. But joy, the reason why I highlighted joy, and actually there was a conversation in the book with my good friend Javier around joys, that I could have edited out, but what you see is the beginning part of like me checking in on how he's doing, and he's just so happy, like the joy, like he just keeps talking about the joy in doing this work. And I was like, oh, thanks for that reminder. And he was like, you know, a lot of what people ask us to be is like this fighter in this space, but they really actually don't really want us to be happy. Like the concept of us living out liberation is also scary for folks. The concept of what our joy, I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that I think Renaissance and Beyonce did for a lot of people. The right, snaps, claps, everything. I think one of the things that she created even more access to were for individuals that have had their culture appropriated, that they can't enjoy themselves, but other people can enjoy and monetize, has in many ways been killed or demonized. Shout out to our Black trans women that every day are literally fighting just to make it from place to place without, if anyone has seen that video that's gone viral, without having garbage bins thrown at them as they're just trying to move through the street. And so joy, I think the way you ended is similar to the way you started as to like, what would a just community look like? And it would look like the expression that doesn't harm anybody of just being and being happy and other people seeing that happiness and not trying to stifle it, right? Because we snuff out a lot of the joy parts of either movements. A lot of what people know about movements is in many ways the quote unquote militant parts or the civil disobedience of movements. But to sustain those movements, there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of gumbo, there's a lot of jokes, there's a lot of fights. Like these are the things that people don't necessarily see, that those who are privileged, and I do see it as a privilege to be in organizing spaces, we know that there's no reason why we would be there if there wasn't joy. And most of this is unpaid. So there has to be something that reminds us of our humanity. There has to be something that reminds us that it's all worth it. And so for me, the reason why joy was important to raise is because I do think that our happiness, and this is not a sexy equity conversation, but the appearance of our progress is often connected to things that other people outside of us have perceived as joy. And whether that's social mobility, whether that's, well, there are some Black and brown kids in my kids' class, so clearly there's progress. Or this concept of saying, like, we had a Black president and then all of this is gone over. All of these things are like, yes, we got a Black president and we should maybe have 25 more, right? Like, we should not limit joy or limit progress because there's been a representation of what you think is a happy being that somehow wasn't tainted by the legal system or mental health institutions or all those other spaces that you raised, that there's something about not talking about joy that maybe is also hurting our movements, that may also be preventing people from joining into the movement of doing this work. Because for any struggle that's out there, we are doing what we need to remind each other in small ways that it's not only worth the doing, but it's also worth other people joining in the fight. So it is a hard thing to ask people to join the equity fight, not just for the fighting of it, but because it actually, or at least my hypothesis is that we will actually experience more joy collectively fighting in this, and it's not the fight that we should be excited about as much as, like, on the other side, the joy of doing something collective that none of us in this room, regardless of race, culture, or creed, none of us inherited a joyful society, right? So in some ways it is radical to fight for joy because we didn't inherit it, right? And I don't think the fight was enough. I think a lot of people are fatigued by the fight. So we actually have to start talking about the joy that in many ways has been secret for many of us and sacred in some ways, but we have to express that there is joy in the fires as well. Interesting.
Then, it's okay.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for talking about particularly, I think I really wanted to come back to this idea of joy because I think you're right. To join the fight is one thing, but it's to think about the turn, right, and really think about in the work. There is joy in community. There is joy in collaboration. There can be joy in the things that we do collectively together. So thanks so much. We have 3 minutes left. So we have a lot of questions to answer in 3 minutes. So I'm going to try to summarize some of the questions and see the linkages, okay? I'm going to do my best here. So we have questions about organization versus individual equity work. Then we have that related to how we think about joy and embodying that joy in the work. We have a question about the figurehead and with doing that work. What does it look like? How do we get out of the figurehead, particularly when institutions are resistant, right? And resistant, what those next steps look like. And then we have this question about the culture of DEI, the pushback. I think it was DIT, which he was, but, and then the last question is about power and the resonance of power in this equity work and how, right, we actually deal with power in terms of outcomes and process. So I'll leave it to you all to unpack. I need to.
I'll just very quickly, the first question spoke to me, and the kind of the distinction between kind of individual work and systemic work. I think it speaks to the many ways that racism works, that it is individual, there's individual animus and bias that we have to address, but changing individual, like focusing on the individual racist that throws racial slurs, or the one person who won't hire people of color, that's not going to bring about a transformation in the system unless we challenge the system. So we have lots of folks who are focused on DEI being work, and they have these goals, and they want to bring more people of color into their workplaces. They want to bring more people with disabilities into their workplaces. These goals are hollow, whereas they're also doing the work to increase the number of people that have access to the resources, experience, and education that is going to make them kind of attractive in the system that you have, right? Making sure that people have access to the opportunities so that they can then take advantage of the opportunities. It also talks about the broader work around equity. I spent some time last week with the community in Centerville, Illinois, where for decades the county has ignored their water system. It's a predominantly Black community, 90% Black, incredibly low-income community, and the county has just not focused on their water system. And so when it rains for 30 minutes, their house fills with raw sewage. All these folks for decades, this has been happening. Their houses are falling apart, they are crumbling. And the county's focus has been, well, we're going to just buy your houses and raise them. We're going to tear them down. We're not going to fix the system. We're just going to tear the house down and address you. They're going to turn Black homeowners into renters and take their homes away. And so what we're trying to do with that community is make sure that we're not just focused on the individual, but focus on this system. What system led to kind of neglect kind of over decades that caused this to happen to the community of Black folks. So fixing one person's house, giving them that one person money to buy a new house, it's not going to fix that system. So we have to help the individuals whose houses are falling apart, the people who are about to lose their homes, who know where to go. But we still have to fight to fix that system. So we have to do both. And clearly with the joy, bring joy to the work. I take joy in the struggle, in the fight to protect my community, to be with my community, to fight alongside folks that celebrate victories, big victories, small victories, half victories, partial victories, that celebrate it all. And I think it's important for us to do that, to be able to hold the anger and the rage to fight at the same time that we're celebrating all the reasons that we have to celebrate. Okay?
Okay, so we've got power. We've got a power question still on the table. We have the this idea of figurehead and how to get out of that, right? And sort of when you're in the work, right? And then we have the question about the DEI work itself in terms of thinking about the culture shifts there.
So building upon what Deborah had raised is that the thing that makes, I think, this equity work different than other forms of learning, this is related to that personal, systemic, but also the power question that you raised. So I do think that the relationship as an individual in a system is, I think you're absolutely right. You have to think about, like, who am I? And there's several forms of identity. Like, what is my racial identity? And that is something that is work that everyone, I think, has to do. And it's work that a lot of people that are in spaces of privilege do not want to actually confront. But what is it that I inherited? If it makes you feel better, and it should, you should think of it as when I was born, what are the things that I already inherited without doing anything, right? And really being earnest about what that means. It doesn't mean that all of those things are going to show up all of the time. It doesn't make you a good or a bad person. It just is. But it also is very much related to who you are in spaces as it relates to power. I do think that across our team at Cornrows, we're almost agnostic on industry. We support several different industries regardless of what they focus on, but they all have similar problems, especially as it relates to who are the decision makers within their space. I would even argue that even decision makers that look like us do not necessarily not have a white dominant mindset. And it's not their fault. It is the pipeline of leadership is still very much influenced by a white male patriarchal way of being, number one. Number two, we also have some internal cultural stuff that we need to deal with, including you don't get into this role that took me 25 years to get here just like that. So you have some internal hazing things that we also do to each other, which is not something that we created. Again, this understanding that we, in many ways, inherited these forms that are all connected to power. So I do think that individuals have to take on, and this book talks about, it kind of introduces the slave way of doing it, and I put some vulnerable stories of myself called equity journeys that really thinking about when was the first time you knew that you were an intersectional being, what was the first time you knew about race, yada, yada, yada. That's for you to kind of do your personal work. But as Deborah mentioned, part of the reason why even as a lawyer, I could not do courtroom work because that felt too transactional for me. I did not see how we were going to get systemic change. And to be clear, shout out to all my friends, including my sister, who go to courtrooms every day, but I was too impatient for that. So I needed to see mass change, and that meant really looking at policies on a much more systemic level. But I do challenge all of us, because I don't have the answer to this, if we don't challenge the people that in many ways have been grandfathered into positions of power, not whether they've been there for a long time, or the position, the figurehead happens to always look like a particular type of person, then we're actually doing even representation and the fullness of D&I a disservice. Because it shouldn't be that I just come in and slope in an organization. There should be some mobility that also is challenged within those spaces. And I do think that I don't think we recognize how wild it is that we are here with the first Black and the first Black woman president of ACL. Of the position that Dr. Lisa Coleman is in, because we actually need to do both and. We need to reimagine the leaders of our institutions, and we need to create new positions to actually do things. Throw this thing there and say that our demand is not more workshops, the demand is not more trainings. The demand is actually more innovation and imagination, and that does mean, yes, pushing up against the people that are in the roles that haven't changed, but I also think we need to be creating different, more viable, and for the sister that wants to do this as your life work, we need to make sure that the pipelines of sisters like that actually results in her being a decision maker, not just somebody who was harmed inevitably within organization.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rose is joining us to grab you to close us off.
Saying, wow.
Wow.
Many thanks to Dr. Lisa Coleman, Ifeanyi, and Deborah Archer. Please give them a big round. I yield.